Good evening, everyone. We're very happy to welcome you all to the 24th lecture of the Distinguished Lecture Series organized by the Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia. Today, we have the honor of hosting Professor Frank Ruda. He's Senior Lecturer of Philosophy at the University of Dundee, who is here to deliver the talk on a peculiar mode of reproducing power, grotesque sovereignty. We will be recording today's lecture, and at the same time, it's being live streamed for our audiences and subscribers on YouTube. There will be a question-answer session at the end of Professor Ruda's talk, and all of you are requested to kindly post your questions in the chat box, which will be then addressed to Professor Frank Ruda. This lecture series is being organized under the guidance of our head of the department, Professor Simi Malhotra. I request her to kindly deliver the welcome address and introduce Professor Frank Ruda.
Thank you so much, Suman. Professor Frank Ruda, our invited speaker this evening, and all others who have joined us. I, on behalf of the Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia, extend a very warm welcome to all of you to this distinguished lecture series. Friends, as Suman said, this is the 24th lecture of our series, and we are indeed fortunate to have with us Professor Frank Ruda, one of the leading voices of our times, as our distinguished speaker this evening. It is an honor and privilege for us to host Professor Ruda, and we are all waiting to hear him speak on a peculiar mode of reproducing power, grotesque sovereignty. I'm extremely grateful to Professor Ruda for agreeing to share his time and scholarship with us this evening. I cannot thank you enough, Professor Ruda, for agreeing to be a part of this series. I welcome you, and now let me introduce Professor Frank Ruda formally, though he needs no introduction. Professor Frank Ruda is Senior Lecturer of Philosophy at the University of Dundee, UK, as also Professor of Philosophy at the European Graduate School, SASFI, Switzerland, Professor of Philosophy at the Scientific Research Center, Ljubljana, Slovenia, and Professor at the Bombay Institute for Critical Analysis and Research, Mumbai, India. Professor Ruda studied philosophy and German literature at the Ruhr University of Bochum and at the École Pratique des Hautes Études Paris. He was a fellow at the postgraduate program, Forms of Life and Know-how of Living at the Universities of Potsdam and Viadrina, Frankfurt Oder, where he obtained his PhD in philosophy in 2008 with a thesis on Hegel. In 2017, Professor Ruda received his Venia Legendi for philosophy from the Free University of Berlin for his habilitation thesis entitled Worse Than Error, Indifference and Fatalism. He taught, among other places, at Capital Nobel University, Beijing, Bard College, Berlin, Free University of Berlin, Goethe University, Frankfurt, University of Nanjing, Bauhaus University in Weimar, and the University of Potsdam. In addition to 5 edited books in German and English, 4 translations of books by Jacques Rancière, Ali Badiou, Alain Gazupancic into German, and numerous book chapters in journal articles, Professor Ruda has authored 10 books. The latest among these is the forthcoming Indifference and Repetition, with a preface by Ali Badiou, the English version of an earlier book in German by Professor Ruda, which examines problems arising from mythical understandings of freedom that take freedom to be a natural given and identify it as a natural human capacity. This is preceded by his recently published book, Reading Hegel, co-authored with Slavoj Žižek and Agon Hamza, which addresses a number of pressing issues that a contemporary reading of Hegel allows a new perspective on: our relation to the future, our relation to nature, and our relation to the absolute. This book follows Reading Marx, which also Professor Ruda had co-authored with Slavoj Žižek and Agon Hamza, and which attempts to reinvent Marx's thought from diverse contemporary perspectives, including an argument for reading the Critique of Political Economy as a version of Plato's cave allegory. The book has been translated into numerous languages, such as German, Russian, and Turkish. He also co-authored with Rebecca Comey, The Dash, The Other Side of Absolute Knowing, which examines the occurrences of dashes in 2 very crucial passages in Hegel's oeuvre and develops a Hegelian theory of speculative science. Moving on to Professor Ruda's earlier works, In Gegenfreiheit, Komik and Fatalismus, which is an extension of his earlier work, Abolishing Freedom, a plea for a contemporary use of fatalism, he shows how and why only a form of fatalism, notably comic fatalism, allows for an overcoming of the myth of the givenness of freedom, and he demonstrates that, and I quote him, fatalism is only possible stance that allows us to think freedom without being indifferent, end quote. His book, for Badiou, Idealism Without Idealism, with a preface by Slavoj Žižek, is an in-depth exploration of the dialectical kernel of Ali Badiou's work and elaborates how it allows for a new reading of central figures from Western philosophy like Plato, Descartes, Hegel, and Marx. His earliest book, Hegel's Rabble, an investigation into Hegel's philosophy of right, with a preface by Stavro Zizek, which was also published in German by Professor Ruda himself, presents a systematic investigation of the Hegelian problem of the rabble, arguing that in it we encounter a problem that, and I quote him, Hegel is able neither to resolve nor to sublate, end quote, which complicates standard readings of Hegel's notion of the state. Professor Ruda is also co-editor of the journal Crisis and Critique, and he co-authors a column, Our Files, at the Philosophical Salon of the Los Angeles Review of Books. Professor Ruda, we are so fortunate to have you with us, and we're really looking forward to your talk. Over to you, Professor Ruda. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much, Professor Malhotra, for this very, very kind introduction. I think that is the moment where it is adequate to say, and to quote my friend Stavro Zizek, I'm really happy to be here. So it's not only an academic politeness. This is it would be even nicer to do this in actually in person. What I will be presenting is something that I'm still thinking through, and you will be able to follow me to the point where I think I want to take things up again, but you will see. I'll start with a quotation from Alain Badiou, which in my translation, it's from one of his seminars, reads as follows. A changing vacuity can here be the transitory icon of the democratic game. Therein lies something eminently grotesque. The grotesque is perceived by the whole world, unquote. The first part is called Sovereignty Going Commando. Sometimes it is hardest to see what is impossible to miss. This is not only because one's vision is blurry or blurred, but rather because it is difficult to see what frames one's vision. It is therefore both soothing and unsettling that it has become common currency to assume that the very concept of sovereignty is haunted and intrinsically stricken by powers that exceed its control. Those may ultimately be the powers of nothing at all, since, I quote Jacques Lacan, it is not simply the universe that was created ex nihilo, but also the law. And as he will continue, that it is its supposed embodiment of, so the supposed embodiment of the law, in which there's always, I quote, also an element which it had not reckoned with, one member too many, a character who lies, for example, unquote. The argument about sovereignty's ultimately a sovereign constitution was often taken to shatter any consistent and coherent belief into the former, even though this may have been why it always required belief in the first place. But the argument was rather often put forward by pointing to a population of ghosts in the sovereignty's shadowy past. It has become more than a common coin to assume that the sovereign is not the master in its own house, because the latter is haunted. Sovereign power then became a thriving gravedigger, not overly good at its job and precisely therefore thriving. The cause, as so often, is structural. Sovereignty summons its ghost each time it attempts to exorcise and inter them. Persistent ghostbusting is prone to spectral overpopulation. The conjured specters bear witness to the non-sovereign constitution of sovereignty. Sovereignty started to appear and look increasingly non-sovereign, but there's a tipping point. There can be, and that's what I'm trying to figure out in the following remarks, an inversion of this very dynamic. Something begins to disappear through its ghostly over-visibility. The specters seem to disappear when there's nothing but ghosts in sight. This is when they start to live a life of their own. The specter of the sovereign then becomes the specter not only attached to, but potentially supporting the sovereign function. Le spectre est le souverain, to parody Jacques Derrida. Then the specters divorce from their actual birthplace. Sovereignty might be haunted, but its ghosts can create their own regime of spectral visibility, of spectrability, which can protect the sovereign function. not all specters, this is what I'm trying to say, are subversive. Obviously, some are sovereignty's friends. Certainly, sovereignty has long been said to be able to assimilate forms of subversion and critique and repression, repurpose them into an internal part of its own operation. Michel Foucault, for example, as some in this room know much better than I do, has famously claimed in the first volume of the History of Sexuality that where there's power, there's resistance, but that also implies that any resistance is not yet converted power, right? So resistance is an internal feature of the differentiation, of the reinvention of power itself. So an instance of the reproduction of power, that is part of the deadlock that I think Foucault tries to solve. But in some historical conjunctures, it can resort, power can resort to the ghostly return of its own repressed and start collaborating with its own spectrum. It's like ontology 2.0. This names the spectral collaboration that remodels the ghost. In this case, sovereignty takes its innermost inconsistency and starts working with it. The former in classical, maybe classical mode, the assimilatory strategy can be detected in the paradigmatic transformations of the operational mode of power. Think, for example, of those transformations that took place in the reaction to the events of May 68, broadly speaking, with the new spirit of capitalism's old spirit. Luc Boltanski and Yves Schiapello have written a book on that, how capitalism became, one could say, flexible, with an expression of the German scholar Jürgen Link. The latter, the type of spectral collaboration, can be detected when political power, especially in the West, adopts a particularly vexing modus operandi. It is one that, I quote Michel Foucault, often caused laughter, unquote, even though it frequently and ultimately proved to be terrifying. Sovereignty can either become more flexible and dynamic in its operations, that's the first in classical, what I tentatively call classical mode, but sovereignty can also go, and it's surprisingly as classical, I want to argue, go grotesque, and then it goes commando. This latter concatenation of concepts of sovereignty and the grotesque has been commented in passing by Michel Foucault. While investigating the functioning of psychiatric power and the workings of its sovereignty effects, that's a term introduced by Joseph Vogel, Foucault mentions a specific type of sovereign conduct, I quote, one of the essential processes of arbitrary sovereignty, unquote, that he, not unsurprisingly, saw at work already in the Roman Empire. And Foucault basically argues that this is, that's again a quote, a type of power that appears from, no quote, Nero to Elagabalus in the functioning of the Roman Empire. And he detects it even in the very constitution and in the workings of Mussolini and Hitler. So there is a link, something that links, that brings together a figure like Nero and Hitler and Mussolini. Foucault addresses this strange concatenation of sovereignty, or this figure of arbitrary sovereignty in terms of grotesque sovereignty. The grotesque is what displays sovereign power in its naked arbitrariness and vulgarity. It is a mode of power working on and with its own return repressed, so that ultimately nothing, and thereby only, one could say, repression is repressed. So nothing is repressed, everything is out in the open, but thereby the very operation of repression is repressed, right? I mean, that is, I think, the structure. That's not Foucault's rendering, but I think this is what he's somehow saying. What is grotesque sovereignty? It does neither present or represent a failure or mishap of the sovereign function, nor its monstrous and abnormal excrescence. This means it is not an external accident that would distract or hinder sovereignty from the outside, nor does sovereignty degenerate in it. Rather, grotesque sovereignty, and now I again quote Michel Foucault, is one of the cogs that are an inherent part of the mechanism of power, unquote. It is essentially an operational power form, a way of power to work. Sovereignty can always go commando and grotesque all the time, anywhere. But What are the conditions, one could ask, for the grotesque, the sovereign in its bare form to come out of the closet? This question addresses what Foucault calls the problem of the infamy of sovereignty, the problem of the infamy of sovereignty. And that is a crucial formulation because, as you may know, Foucault has written a smallish text that is called The Life of the Infamous Man. And therein he traces the fate and destiny and historical fate of all those individuals that have been touched by power, for example, because they have been imprisoned or they were made a case or whatsoever. But they seem to be appearing at the margins of society. Right? Whereas the sovereign is in the center, and the sovereign is also as infamous as the infamous men at the margin. So there is a let's say concatenation. There's a relationship between the margins and the center. This question that he addresses as the problem of the infamy of sovereignty is a problem that Foucault sees occupying its place in literature, in the literature from Shakespeare through Balzac, Dostoevsky, and Coquelin to Kafka. That is a discussion of its own, why it's specifically literature that has a weight of addressing. What this literature depicts is how, I'm quoting Foucault, a discourse or an individual can have effects of power that their intrinsic qualities should disqualify them from having, unquote. It shows how someone can produce sovereign power effects, even if she, because of the ways in which she behaves, thinks, or talks, appears fully disqualified from having any power at all. Sovereignty can self-disqualify itself without losing power. That's the paradox. That's the problem. Let's put it like that. This is then a sovereign that operates by making explicit constantly that there is no, in Lacanian terminology, no big other, one could say no real sovereign. It is a power that appears to undo power, and thereby reinstates its power. It is like saying the new theological credo is that there is no God. The best way of reinstating that there is a big other is through the claim that there is no big other, right? There are no laws of history and all these formulations. Another who becomes all pervasive. This is another who a big other who becomes all pervasive in and through the very way in which she declares to have disappeared. We thus, for Foucault at least, encounter here a form of sovereign power that works with the negation of its own negation. And I quote Foucault again, an almost theatrical disqualification of the origin of power, unquote, in the very exercise of power. Right? So power disqualifying itself in its exercise. The grotesque sovereign is not the clown that entertains the king. It is the king as entertaining clown. The dejustification embodied and practiced by the grotesque sovereign does not only pertain to the idea that sovereign power would rely on competence, knowledge, or capacity. It rather formally disqualifies even the idea that sovereign power is qualified in any sense. It is sovereign. It is the sovereign disqualification as its qualification, its dejustification as its justification. And furthermore, what appears to be its disappearance is its ultimate and often invisible reappearance. This complicates, for example, the reading, I think, that someone like Slavoj Žižek has given of Hegel's rebel, Hegel's monarch, as a figure that in some sense is just, as Hegel himself says, dotting the I, so a purely functional sovereign. But what is a purely functional sovereign in a dysfunctional state? One may raise this question, and I think this is what Foucault is struggling with. This does not, or articulating here in passing, this does not mean that Foucault suggests that the grotesque sovereign displays a hidden plan. The grotesque sovereign is not the genius. That's, I think, absolutely important. It's not the genius in well-functioning disguise. She is what she is, a moron, a buffoon, and nevertheless sovereign. I know very well, not only that she's an idiot, but that she does not exist. And she even confirms, but nevertheless, she is sovereign. There is a very peculiar, let's say, reflexive twist to the inefficiency of knowledge. And this is what is grotesque, right? Grotesque is that we know all that, but nevertheless, there is a sovereign. Grotesque sovereignty can therefore, in its undisguised nakedness, appear to unmask the way sovereignty and power functions, but ultimately doesn't. This is why its nakedness can function as ultimate disguise of power. One thinks it's vulgar, it's just coming out, but all this transparency is the ultimate disguise. And here we might even encounter also an idea of the emancipatory or proto-emancipatory potential of anything going there, of bearing, since there is a possibility of a disguise non-exposing itself through revelation and transparency. The grotesque sovereign is the naked emperor who admits that she is naked, that sovereignty is always naked, that there is no sovereignty, or let me put it in the most horrible terms, that sovereignty is fake news. But this is what makes the sovereign sovereign, right? That declaration. She uses, I quote Peter Sloterdijk, a disguise that does not conceal anything, unquote, but thereby everything. Cynical reason, as Sloterdijk once coined it, works by knowing that something is the case and by not acting on the basis of this very knowledge. It thus operates through fetishistic disavowal, as has been remarked endlessly in the aftermath of Octave Manoni's famous paper on this issue, the formula of which, as you may know, is je sais bien mais quand même, I know very well, but nevertheless. I know, but nothing follows from it. I bracket my knowledge, the practical effectivity of my knowledge. The grotesque sovereign relies on the workings of reason's disavowing tendency, but she does not practically bracket this or that knowledge, that she's a gangster or liar, etc. But the practically mobilizes the knowledge into its non-sovereign constitution to suspend the very practical effectivity of this knowledge. So it does something, right, about sovereign's non-sovereign constitution. Mobilizing that even the sovereign is not sovereign is the way in which grotesque sovereignty establishes her sovereignty. That's what I'm trying to say, right? That is the ultimate assimilation of what was supposed to be critical theory and a subversive insight. It's the capitalization on deconstruction, let me put it like that. If traditional forms of the critique of power relied on an act of unmasking some particular dishonesty or act of corruption, right? She's a gangster, so she should not be sovereign, and thus remove the appearance of legitimacy, the grotesque sovereign discourse assimilates this critical gesture and through an act of self-disqualification, transforms it into a gesture of empowerment. It establishes a solidarity with his very own enemy, a reified, one could say, union of opposites. Its divestment is its ultimate investment, the divestiture, its investiture, the denudation, its costume. This is self-criticism reified. Right? It's like a reappropriation almost of Maoist self-critique and put into the most reactionary working. But there's more and not more to the new grotesque sovereign than meets the naked eye. Her nudity is and is not, one could say, just another costume. Foucault remarks that the grotesque sovereign makes apparent the gap between power and its representation. That's one of the things that we can learn from. The appearance of this gap creates a space that is then immediately populated by all the kinds of spontaneous, fantastic ontologies of power, protective of power, as if defense mechanisms of power. Paradigmatically, things like power does and is not corrupt. It is the grotesque sovereign who is corrupt, right? I mean, so the state would work better if just someone else would govern. It is the gap, and I'm just for now heuristically not distinguishing between the state and power, just to be clear. It is the gap generated by the queen's second body, the gap in or that is the body of the grotesque sovereign. So the grotesque sovereign populates exactly the space between power and its representation. It is the substantialization of the split that is constitutive of the big other, to put in more technical Lacanian terms, and even Foucault participated in this to a certain extent by calling this gap itself power. So there is something that I think one could discuss here. When the gap, the separation at the basis of sovereignty, is substantialized and thus turned into its own figure of sovereignty, this is what I'm trying to say, right? There's a gap that seems to separate power and its representation, and this gap itself can become a form of power. In the moment of sovereignty's own self-disavowal, the grotesque sovereign emerges like an obscene phoenix from the supposed ashes of sovereignty. The grotesque sovereign, and I think this is not developed by Foucault, thereby effectively works in the service of what can easily appear as a neutralization of sovereignty. Through the grotesque mode of operation, sovereign power or sovereignty, I'm using the two of them synonymously because there's a German scholar called Friedrich Barck who has written a book called Figuren der Souveränität, who argues that even though the modus operandi of power changes for Foucault, Foucault would never basically say it's a debunking of sovereignty per se, right? Sovereignty just takes on a different operational form. This is why I'm using the two terms synonymously. Through the grotesque mode of operation of sovereign power, sovereignty separates itself from itself. And I will elucidate why in the next step, just like in 10 seconds, actually, why that is necessary sometimes. This does not simply mean that one splits into two here, as the famous motto goes, but rather that through the gap it creates between itself and its representation, sovereignty is enabled to distance itself from itself. It distances itself from itself. Going grotesque is therefore what one might call a defense mechanism of power. Power at times operates better and more efficient in a grotesque way. Second part is called in defense of lost systems. There are, I think, material historical conditions that enable such grotesque function. There are fulfilled when there is what Thomas Damm once called the disqualification of the system itself, unquote. If grotesque sovereignty is an internal element of the functioning of power, that is Foucault, it comes to the fore when there is a systemic problem with a given regime of power, when the system is struggling, when there is a crisis. Foucault, quite different from his usual methodological demeanor, I think, identifies the grotesque as therefore, as an almost transhistorical feature of the effectivity of power in times of emergency. Right? Why does Foucault not think that the grotesque sovereign can appear all the time? Because power can be in crisis all the time. Right? I mean, so it's never absolutely certain that it can reproduce itself without problem. So power can always retort in grotesque ways. And when a political, say, or economic system is inherently unsustainable, and everyone knows it, think financial crisis, right? Grotesque sovereigns appear. They do something to the knowledge of a system's unsustainability. They embody, and this is not developed by Foucault, but I think it is an implication of something that is in line with what he says. They do something to the knowledge of a system's unsustainability. They embody the systematic disqualification in such a way that it is separated from the system within the system. Grotesque sovereigns thereby are what allows for a system to continue to function, I quote Alenka Zupancic, not in spite of our disillusionment, but precisely because of it, unquote. Grotesque sovereigns embody the crisis that generated them in such a way that they take it away from the system and on themselves. This is the crisis that, according to Koji and Karatani, from a certain moment on, repeatedly emerges in the midst of the modern nation state. Grotesque sovereigns are expressions. They are somehow the dysfunctionality of the system. They are expressions, and they are, because they are the living invisibilization of a systematic crisis in the form of its most visible expression. One sees that something must be wrong if one has a grotesque sovereign, but nevertheless, one is tempted to think it is the grotesque sovereign's fault and not the system's fault. That is my argument. Right? And that is the gap that I was trying, right? That's the economy of the gap between power and its representation. This is why one can easily turn them into an object of critique and ridicule, which can appear as if it does at the same time not affect the legitimacy of the system at all. One just needs to watch. That's one of my guilty pleasures, I have to say. One just needs to watch American liberal late night show moderators or the comedians. They all think they see through the vulgarity and so forth of the conservatives, right? I mean, Jimmy Kimmel and people like that, Stephen Colbert. If you watch them, I just admit it, I enjoy that. But nevertheless, they really think that they have the insight into why, let's say, someone like Trump is just vulgar, and the system itself remains totally unaffected by this vulgarity, right? I mean, so there is a weird detachment between what appears to be a symptom of a systemic crisis and its embodiment. Okay. An element of the grotesque surveillance function is therefore to nurture the belief that if someone else ruled, there would be no crisis of the system at all. Oh, finally, after Trump, Biden, and a return to normality, right? That was by objectively embodying and individualizing the legitimacy, by objectively embodying and individualizing the legitimacy crisis of the system, they silently work for its reproduction and justification by, even if often in an unwilling manner, taking the whole of its inconsistency and contradiction onto themselves. There was a repeated critique of American sovereigns, grotesque sovereigns, that they're contradicting themselves, right? Not the system is contradicting itself, but they are. Grotesque sovereigns are transubstantiation of systematic dysfunction, incoherence, or contradiction. They're like idiotic messiahs of a tumbling world who are repeatedly crucified in public, but nevertheless survive. They bring together the highest sovereignty and the lowest carnality, vulgarity, etc., into a crucified union of opposites, telling the truth where one should lie and lying otherwise. In this sense, they sublate the systematic problem by not sublating, but by seeming to be it. By seeming to be it. Their defense mechanic, i.e. their essentially reproductive quality, appears in the repeated calls for a return to normality, a call which almost always immediately emerges with them. Grotesque sovereigns are thus condensations and displacements of a systematic legitimacy crisis. They condense systematic inconsistency and thereby concentrate and bind all political, media, economic attention, displacing it from the real of the crisis, from the real crisis. As the French liberal politician Charles de Rémusat once remarked, I quote, "These idiots are endowed with a rare and powerful faculty, namely that of placing themselves at the center of human affairs." And that is what qualifies them. Right? They can bind attention, political, media, economic. They allow to internally isolate the apparent inconsistency of a system as if it were external to it. By embodying the problem of the system, they turn it within the system, away from the system. Grotesque sovereignty is thus a condensed way of treating the contradictions of a system in the midst of a system by not treating, but by, and that's now the emphasis, displacing. It's displacement. For Foucault, Western bureaucracy is a one embodiment of grotesque sovereignty, because one thinks bureaucracy is the problem, right? You see, right? If things were less bureaucratic, the system would not have a problem. But that is precisely their function, right? One displaces it away from the system. It brings together solving and not solving the crisis, and the contradictory condensation of logically disparate elements is what ultimately makes the grotesque. That's the definition of the grotesque, right? You bring together disparate elements, logically incoherent elements. A higher form, because the inconsistency becomes manifest, of non-sublation, because it is at the same time invisibilized. Foucault's own paradigm case for such an operation was a literary one, again. Alfred Jarry's infamous King Ubu, the vulgar wretch, as it is called in Ubu Rex, who does not disguise, but who openly displays his vulgarity incessantly, and who practices the idea, I quote Alfred Jarry, that injustice is just as good as justice. Unquote. He embodies the corrupted, terrorist nature of sovereign power in times of systematic crisis. It's all about war and the like, without disguising the inherent corruption of power, nor its crisis. The grotesque sovereign is in other, namely Karl Marx's words, a symptom, I quote Marx, a symptom of decay. Third part, from symptoms to symptom. Grotesque sovereignty is a symptom. And let's not forget that according to Jacques Lacan, Marx invented the symptom. The proletariat is a symptom of the very functioning of capitalism. That there is a symptom means that something went wrong but continues to function. That is, right, the symptom is a way of a system that is in crisis to find a mode to continue to function even though it's in crisis. Something went wrong when the repression of a crisis was unsuccessful, and in Freud's words now, I quote, such failures of repression are the precondition of the formation of symptoms. Unquote. What this means is that symptoms embody the inhibition. Something is not functioning. There is a blockage of a function. Right? Something does not work, and they embody it. This is absolutely the embodiment theory, I think is crucial. They are an inhibition with what Freud calls a pathological implication. What that means is different from pathological inhibitions that modify the same function without hindering its general scope. To become a vegetarian implies a specific inhibition of the nutrition function, but not necessarily any pathological one, obviously, or for the purpose of placing it under the aegis of another function. Inhibiting the excretion function helps when one seeks to gain greater movement independence or an interaction with others. A symptom is formed, ultimately, when a function is inhibited, not because it is redetermined in any of those senses, right? And not placed under the aegis of another function, nor to be modified, but because it does not function anymore. So if the function doesn't function, it creates symptoms. This happens when different and conflicting renderings of a particular function seek to avoid, as Freud claims, seek to avoid coming into conflict, unquote. Symptoms are essentially defense mechanisms, that's, I think, important, whose purpose it is to prevent a conflict from becoming manifest when and because the libidinal system does not have any internal means for resolving it. Otherwise, there would be no conflict in the first place, right? Against the background of this Freudian account, grotesque sovereignty can be rendered as being what Freud calls a defense symptom, An attempt, one could say, to avoid bringing to the fore a crisis of the existing and established system that is already out in the open, and for which the very system has found no sovereign way of resolving. So when there's a crisis of sovereignty, different types of sovereigns emerge. Grotesque sovereigns are thus defense symptoms indicating the decay and loss of sovereignty of a political and economic system. This is why for Foucault, grotesque sovereignty can emerge all the time. It does effectively emerge when a political regime is in crisis or on the verge of collapse. It is no one else but Marx who stated along the same lines that the historical France in which took place the coup of Napoleon III, as in the aftermath of 1848, followed a similar logic. With him coming to power, I quote Marx now, the Republic has lost nothing but its semblance of respectability. Present-day France, Marx writes, was contained in a Finnish state within the parliamentary republic. It only required a bayonet thrust for the abscess to burst and the monster to spring forth before our eyes, unquote. It's from the 18th Brumaire. The grotesque sovereign is the monster that lurks in the back of any system crisis, just waiting for the wrong moment to come out. And as Marx indicates, so did, I quote, the grotesque chief of the Society of the 10th of December, that is Marx again from the 18th Brumaire, I quote again, the grotesque ventriloquist in the Tuileries, unquote, Napoleon III, who embodies the grotesque union of the greatness of Napoleon and the pettiness of the nephew. Since when, I quote Roger Price, conservative politicians were drawn towards the restoration of social order, and Napoleon appeared to be weak, a clown they could use, they used. Marx can precisely therefore state in the preface to the second edition of his 18th Brumaire that he will, I quote, demonstrate how the class struggle in France created circumstances and relationships that made it possible for a grotesque mediocrity to play a hero's part. So the grotesque is an element of historical, let's say, non-development. Napoleon III is the grotesque providence of Europe, in Marx's words, the grotesque as providence of European sovereignty. I think this helps to clarify that grotesque sovereignty operates through reference to a higher principle, the country, the people, that it at the same time does and does not serve. Right? It protects the system and claims higher values, but it doesn't serve it. It does serve it because being the embodied expression of the systemic crisis, it protects the system by condensing and displacing its dysfunctionality. It does not serve it because it can only serve the system by actually embodying its problem. Grotesque sovereignty is a manifestation of the problem whose origin it makes disappear. The crisis over visibility produces its invisibility. The grotesque sovereign serves the system by not directly solving its problem, but by appearing to be it, and thus by appearing to solve its problems. Grotesque sovereigns are semblances of heroic crisis resolution, crisis solution, or what Freud, and that's the definition of the symptom, calls compromise solution. How do symptoms speak? For Foucault, the grotesque discourse is, I quote Foucault, a childish discourse, a discourse basically addressed to children. The grotesque sovereign is a sovereign child or baby. Just think about how many times Trump was compared with a baby, constantly acting as if he doesn't know. That is Slavoj Žižek who claimed that, and thereby speaking and appealing as if always to those whom one believes not to know, namely children. Grotesque sovereignty thereby can be said to embody a political and historical regression. This is the point. Which is why, similar to children for psychoanalysis, its motifs are so plainly transparent that one barely needs an interpretation. Freud basically said, well, if you analyze dreams of very young children, if you promise them ice cream, they dream of ice cream, right? I mean, so, and hence there's no need for an interpretation. And it seems that has moved from the dream to public discourse, and it's right. It's not difficult to see that it articulates what it wants, but it's very difficult to see how this transparency actually disguises its own functioning. This also allows its discourse to appear in all its seriousness as if one cannot take it seriously. What makes it childish is therefore also what makes it operate more efficiently. But this is also why it can easily become politically disastrous, because the infantilization, and we could say a lot about, let's say, philosophers diagnosing infantilizations, but Yu speaks of the infantilization of the adult. Mladen Dolar even pointed out that there is an infantilization even pertaining to children. Right? We treat children as if they were just children, which makes us forget the lesson of psychoanalysis. Adorno diagnosed a certain infantilization of all consciousnesses in the negative dialect, in the aesthetics. And Paul Virilio spoke of an infantilization that's at the heart of American culture in the entire time after Bill Clinton came to power, which is also, I think, an interesting fact. But it is politically disastrous because the infantilization that spreads from the sovereign throughout the entire socioeconomic and political body. Marx, therefore, was able to describe that in terms of an anarchy in the name of order, or as what Badiou called generalized infantilization, because it does not need no interpretation. It is the ultimate test of any political interpretation, it seems to me. An example that Foucault employs is not Napoleon, but fascism. His point is intricate. Since it's tempting to apply the category for each and every time a grotesque sovereign appears, one could always say, well, they're fascists. And people talked like that, right? But might there be something like a generic fascism? That's a term Alain Badiou coined in Logics of Wealth. Foucault does not analyze grotesque sovereignty in terms of fascism. He refers to fascism in terms of grotesque sovereignty, which is something else. This implies that fascism is for him a derivative political stance produced as and in reaction to a systemic crisis. And it also implies that it does not solve the problem it's generated by, but nevertheless pretends to. Slavoj Žižek is quite good on fascism as a defense mechanism. I think. Fascism is the expression of a problem that is presented as the problem solution, an exemplum of a dialectic a la grotesque, one could say a grotesque dialectic. But this puts pressure on determining how the actual systemic or system crisis is generated, as not all system crises generate grotesque sovereigns, but only some do, right? I mean, they must be real justification crises. So what is the crisis problem that the grotesque sovereign is supposed to solve? This is, I think, even more relevant because Foucault's insistence on the idea that grotesque sovereigns can appear all the time in all historical conjunctions. He seems to identify a general, almost ahistorical structure, resource, and the grotesque organization of power. But can one? That's I think the question one could raise. Can one specify a type of crisis that actually leads to? Are there historical conditions from which one can learn that one might be able to formalize, so that one can learn when a grotesque sovereign emerges to reverse the order? So if we have a grotesque sovereign, we know that there is a system. To answer this question, I think one must say something about the events that force this crisis of a system that then allows the grotesque sovereign to crawl out of its swamp and inverse the order. If I had more time, I would right now have suggested that Marx's 18th Brumaire presents such an analysis of how a failed revolutionary attempt, an attempt of the organized workers in Europe all over, that was crushed and exhausted the political energy of the bourgeoisie, led to a historical conjuncture that, even though it formally implements parliamentary democracy, led to the abolishment of parliamentary democracy. So everything began with something going wrong. And I think from there on, one can start not only thinking about how history is written as history of emancipation, but history can also and must also be written from the perspective of failed emancipation, from the perspective of non-realized emancipation, from the perspective, I hope you get my point. So the primacy is still with emancipation, right? Still with freedom, but freedom can just fail. Emancipation can just go wrong, right? So revolutions can just, Marx was obsessed with, and I'd say already Hegel, with why after the French Revolution, there was no German Revolution, right? And so the non-happening of the German Revolution, to speak like Sherlock Holmes for once, is in itself an interesting fact, right? I mean, you know that famous Sherlock Holmes line that the dog didn't bark in the night is itself a curious fact, right? It's that the revolution did not come to Germany is itself an interesting fact in that very sense, because failed revolutions or non-happening revolutions can generate what I would term creative regressions, right? So a new regressive tendency that seems to be creative, so that seems to mobilize and do something, but they're ultimately regressive. They're ultimately regressive because they, emerging from what one could call political parapraxis, like as in Freud, a parapraxis is if you want to say one thing and you say a mother, forgive me that bad joke, but if you want to do one thing and you fail or you don't do what you intend to do, some unanticipated results may be generated. And what they do, and that's the last point I want to make, is somehow they do something with the very working of history, with the very working operation of historicity. Let me make that point in 1 minute. I think just to give you a very trivial empirical example. Again, Trump on Twitter. The news for a long period of, during his reign, were always about the things that he tweeted, and he tweeted this thing now, this thing then, and they were contradictory, but the entire media attention was on these contradictions, right? On these, like he said this, he said this, he said this. No one zoomed out, so everyone was absolutely banned. By obsessed almost or magnetically compelled to look at the statement because he was the sovereign, obviously, right? He said this, he said this, he said this. But that strangely generated the effect as if nothing ever happened, and de facto nothing ever happened. So like the impression of historical constant historical transformation can be a symptom that nothing changes at all, right? It can be a disguise of historical standstill. So that one could say, and that's the last thing I think I want to articulate, maybe 2 sentences, that it's not a historical standstill as a moment of dialectical development, but rather a dialectic in standstill that one needs to think and one needs to conceive of to understand the operations of this peculiar mode of power that I call a grotesque sovereign, and that raises the stakes how to understand the working of negativity, right, in these formations. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Ruda. What an important talk this has been for us, Professor Ruda. I can't thank you enough. I mean, you've alerted us to so many things. I mean, of course, I mean, your formulation about grotesque sovereignty is something which is fundamental for us to understand sovereignty itself and how particularly it assimilates the whole idea of sovereignty and poses a challenge for all kinds of critical discourses that we seem to think and how it gets digested by the counter discourses in some senses. So it's such an important thing. But I think your formulation also about that how grotesque sovereigns themselves are symptoms of a non-functioning system, which kind of through these condensations and displacements hides, you know, and I was reminded of that phrase of hiding in the light, you know, it hides itself, is such an important formulation. And it talks to our locations in terms of the politics that we are dealing with and the kind of symbols that you've invoked. But I think for me, the most important thing is what you reminded us, which is, you know, going back to Marx and Marx's 18 Brumaire as probably a way of reading and probably engaging with this particular idea of grotesque sovereignty itself, and not necessarily looking at history as only about emancipation, but as precisely about the failure of emancipation. And I think if one has to really start unmasking and reading beyond the symptom into the malaise that probably we're encountering in all parts of the world, one needs to probably start with that premise to be able to actually look at the history as a failure of emancipations of all kinds of systems in that sense. And I think this point that you make about the dialectical standstill could probably be a way of talking through this to be able to arrive on the other side in some senses. But Professor Ruda, it has been such a valuable intervention. I mean, we've been waiting for this talk, and, you know, I mean, just hearing you speak has been so invigorating for us. And I'm sure there would be lots of responses to what you've said. It's an extremely important lecture, Professor Ruda, and we're really grateful to you for bringing these thoughts to us. But I'm going to hand over the question and answer session to Susan, who's going to, and I don't want to really stand between the questions and you. So I'm going to hand over to Susan, and Susan will help us run through the next round. So Susan.
Thank you so much, Professor Malhotra.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Malhotra. And of course, thank you, Professor Ruda. We have a lot of questions here for you. So I think if you allow, we can start with the first question from Dr. Sandhya Davison. In fact, I request Dr. Sandhya Davison to perhaps directly ask Professor Ruda your question.
Thanks so much, Anne, and thanks so much, Professor Ruda and the entire team at Jamia for organizing this talk. It's really, it's brilliant as always. So, I mean, thank you so much for that talk on the excess or the limit of the structure and the excess as the grotesque sovereign, and which makes visible the structure of power, which otherwise maintains its benevolence as the visible common, right? So in relation to the collaborative subject haunted by the structure that you had mentioned earlier, I'm really sorry about my neighbor's dog. I kind of want to point to the Marxist conception of practice or praxis, especially as he delineates in his theses on Feuerbach, and the inevitability of power in a capitalized system. And if you're reading this, perhaps alongside Foucauldian governmentality, right? In the absence then of any radical freedom practices within the structure of capital, and by extension, the limitations on getting away from the practices of of the unfree structure itself. I would want to ask, how does one think radical freedom? Because every move away from the structure is always already is a foregone kind of a conclusion in many ways. It's foreshadowed by the structure itself. So how do we then think radical freedom and then go on to enact it as praxis, perhaps? Or are we kind of, as subjects in a capitalized structure, are we kind of cast into the role of the perhaps unwilling but ultimately unfree and eternal collaborator?
Thank you so much. I mean, it's a very, very demanding question, obviously. I mean, I think one can answer it by at least pointing to two concepts, maybe, or two realms, conceptual realms. First, Foucault himself was struggling with that, and I am not per se a Foucauldian, but Foucault was struggling with that because, as I briefly mentioned, he thought power creates new forms of resistance, but very often puts them in the very service of the functioning of power. I mean, that's why I refer to 68, right? I mean, all the liberation stuff, great. And what you get at the end is the Apple company, right? And creative new forms of capitalism, right? That look more fancy or sexy or nice or whatever, but are maybe even more oppressive in some sense, right? So, and what does that mean if because that seems to be a certain limit of a certain type of structuralism, however flexible it gets. And I think that Marx is actually very good on this, because this is why I think one can give and present a reading. This is why I insisted so much that Marx himself calls Napoleon III a symptom of decay and so forth, because he reads Napoleon III's emergence as a result of things going politically wrong. So of political parapraxis. And that means that Marx, and that would be the second conceptual realm, not structure, but history in the strong sense, that history in itself might be more multidirectional than one would think, right? I mean, in the sense that it's not a layer model of whatsoever, but it's very unclear, it's very difficult, or maybe it's an invitation to rethink where political potentials lie, right? I mean, because it is not, don't forget, like Marx calls Napoleon III a political like a symptom of decay, and he thinks it's a symptom of what of the working class, of the proletarian revolution not having found its appropriate form. But briefly thereafter, there is the Paris Commune that he calls the finally found political form for a workers' organization, right? I mean, so it's a question of form. What's to do with what went wrong? And I think, I mean, to speak to this about this today means that the amazingly surprising thing is, after the financial crisis of 2007-8 and so forth, that there was no left-wing political formal answer of how to organize it. That was the moment that people waited for since the 60s in some sense, right? I mean, a system that just in everyone's face said, look, I'm dysfunctional. And the failure to propose any formal organizational solution at that very conjuncture, I think, leads to a situation where one is confronted with symptoms that draw one's attention away from this. But that simply means that even sometimes something that is absolutely clear and an insight does not lead directly, that's the multi-directional historical development, to what one would think it does, should lead to, right? And maybe what I'm trying to say is just, or the implication of that is that history, I mean, there's this, I think Marx says that in The Poverty of Philosophy, sometimes history advances through its bad side, he says, right? So sometimes things need to go really wrong and and they appear to be fundamentally, one appears to be fundamentally stuck. What does one get after the French Revolution? Napoleon. What does one get after Napoleon I? Napoleon III. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? I mean, and it's farcical. It's and horrifyingly farcical. So nothing seems to move ever. There seems to be no history. But that isn't a possibility of historical development or learning something about history. That I think that would be the direction of an answer. I hope that is one.
Thank you, Professor Ruda. May I pose the next question? And of course, thank you, Dr. Sandhya. Right. So the next question is, Professor Ruda, thank you for your time and this enriching lecture. I was wondering if you could elaborate on what Foucault meant when he said the infamy of sovereignty, which is seen in literature, in quotes, and your thoughts on the same.
Yeah, I mean, so Foucault speaks briefly about different types in which literature presents the problem of the infamy of sovereignty, namely. And what's that problem? That sovereignty sometimes shows itself in its ugly nakedness, right? That it's all just about power. And just let me give you one example. Think about Kafka, right? Think about the castle, right? And think about the castle. It is absolutely clear that it's absolutely confusing. It is absolutely clear that there is no clear sovereign. It's absolutely clear that there is not even someone to address, right? I mean, all these things seem to be absolutely clear and absolutely out in the open, and nevertheless, nothing collapses. It just keeps functioning. And so literature has ways of articulating the very structure of sovereignty's possibility to show itself in the infamous mode. And what it does thereby, it makes us understand the working. So reading literature then is literally reading the workings of infamous, the logical structure, one could even say, of the grotesque, what I term the grotesque sovereign, by showing its grotesque in its grotesqueness, and maybe political analysis can't do that in the same way. Maybe the approach can't be directly simply political. This was, I mean, the brief move that I made, where I said, well, I mean, pointing out the corrupt. I mean, if you think of, for example, the previous president of Italy, right? Mussolini at one point, I think, got elected. Mussolini, Berlusconi, got elected because he basically said, well, he could solve the garbage crisis in the south of Italy because, I mean, he more or less explicitly pointed that out, because he had mob contacts. Right? I mean, afterwards you can say, well, you have mob contacts, you shouldn't be the sovereign. Right? I mean, it's impossible. So there is something that one, as a direct political action, maybe in this grotesque way, cannot address, but must address somewhat from the side, from a different type of discourse, because thereby one can. This is why. I mean, this is why my reference to liberal American contemporary stand-up comedy or whatsoever, it's just helpless. It does not know what to do with it. As liberal journalism, I mean, it's the same. I think it's the same. I hope that was kind of an answer.
Thank you, Professor. The next question is from Rohit Goel, and I'm reading the question. Thank you, Professor Ruda, for this really thoughtful talk. I couldn't help thinking of another book by Joanne Kopchak, Read My Desire, especially a chapter on Reagan and the love of Reagan despite all his gaffes laughed at on TV. With Claude Lefort, she's suggesting this notion, I think close to your understanding of the grotesque sovereign, that this may be a particularly American phenomenon at a time before Americanism perhaps was actually globalized, as your talk points out. Here she says Americans are counted as citizens, but counted differently by someone, an impossible ask of any universal sovereign. So the best thing that could happen to solve this paradox was the emergence of loving idiots, grotesque sovereigns, Reagan, Trump, love being what we offer to others and ourselves that we ourselves and our beloveds cannot possess. I was wondering if you might say something about this notion of love and the grotesque sovereign as a way out of this paradox, not just in America in the Cold War's end, as Joanne was doing, but more globally today. Thank you so much for that.
Well, thanks, Rod, for that. Well, maybe two things. I mean, there is I think first there are different types of idiots that one really has to distinguish. I don't know if you can. I mean, if you can remember it, Google it. Bush was once, I think, in an American kindergarten and was reading to the children, and he was holding the book the wrong way, right? I mean, just so that, and that seemed. I mean, there is photos of that, and it seemed, maybe it's not true, but I mean, nevertheless, it seemed pretty idiotic. But that type of idiocy is different from the idiocy incarnated by Trump, I think, right? I mean, so there is really, I think there's really a difference, and the difference, and I think the idea of loving idiots is a really good and an important one, and I think Joan Kopchak has a strong point, because the very terrifying thing about someone like Trump, someone like Bolsonaro, someone like Orban is that one enjoys them, right? One enjoys their vulgarity. It is enjoyable seeing him misbehave. It's enjoyable seeing the degenerate children. It's all of this generates a type of not an amusement, but you know, when you that you never just directly just love or hate a villain in a movie, but you love to hate a villain, right? I mean, or you love to love a hero, and this and enjoyment can be exactly that. You can love to be appalled by how disgusting he is, and this generates an attraction and an economy of itself that is, I think, an essential and inherent part in the reproduction of that very type of sovereignty. That did not exist with Bush. I think that is the distinction I would make. So it is very problematic sometimes that there is a libidinal, like an enjoyment attachment to these types of sovereign idiots, because not every type of idiot is the same, and not every system is the same. But that one enjoys to hate them, enjoys to be appalled, and so forth, and that is a way of being drawn to them. Losing sight, even, right? I mean, so I think that's why I refer to that media example, that American television channels just opened basically with the newest tweet forever, because they were all constantly, at least the liberal ones, all constantly appalled. But that generated a massive enjoyment. What has he done now after the third burger and whatever he consumed? I mean, it was ridiculous, and thereby this is the type of condensation, type of being drawn in, that allows for forgetting and an oblivion of a greater historical sequence, seeing that it's not about Trump, it's about the really screwed system that right? I mean, that experienced the most fundamental crisis since hundreds of years. I hope that is an explanation or an answer. Sorry.
Thank you, Professor Ruda. we're exceeding time, but if you'll allow, I'll ask a question or two more. Is that okay? Perfect. Thank you very much. So the next question is from Zahid from Malaysia, and he writes, can we say that by opening the doors widely for the freedom of speech to people, the liberals as sovereigns have managed to turn any counter-hegemonic critique as obsolete or typical, that is, fails to attract followers to seriously believe in such criticisms?
I think, I mean, the freedom of speech issue in this field and today is a very tricky one. Angela Nagel has written a very good book, which is called "Kill All the Normies," and it is, and what she shows is in what way, you know, in the 70s and 80s. The left was often associated with a certain type of transgressive discourse, right? They were the people who said shit in public, or whatever was politically incorrect, and all these kinds of things. But strangely, what I call, let's say, the grotesque sovereigns party appropriated that very transgressive mode, right, of breaking the rules of what one is allowed to say in public, and thereby freedom of speech, freedom of political speech, and thereby forced the previous left into the position which is absolutely problematic, namely of political correctness, of basically, right, I mean, of basically saying you should not say that, we need rules. So strangely, and this is what creates a quite topsy-turvy, I think, political scenario and conjuncture, the left becomes more conservative, indicating, if the term the left means anything today, I mean, I'm doubtful, but the left, at least in many Western countries, becomes a kind of embodiment and the defense of regulatory rules of interaction, whereas the right constantly makes fun of that and appropriates the transgressive and so forth energy. And if you look at, I mean, the grotesque sovereigns of our world, they're constantly saying things in the public realm that have been impossible to articulate publicly 20 years ago. I mean, really things that would have killed political careers 20 years ago are right now tolerated. And what that means is that this changes the very framing of the public political realm. This is why I'm saying that the freedom of speech has been hijacked. But what do we do if freedom of speech has been hijacked by right-wingers? Let me put it like that. This is, one then cannot simply say and endorse freedom of speech, but one can also not simply say we need to stick to political correctness rules, because that is the wrong path. And that is, I think, part of the dilemma that this political conjuncture forces upon us.
Thank you, Professor. The last question for this evening. Thank you for this lecture, Professor Ruda. Could you please elaborate on or help us make further sense on how grotesque sovereignty is constituted and sustained by the media in the post-truth age?
I think, well, I mean, I think it is similar to what I tried to articulate a bit earlier. It really functions as a twofold or two-layer operation of condensation, right? I mean, so my argument was the grotesque sovereign moves the crisis away from the system by taking it onto herself, onto himself. That's the operation of displacement. And it condenses them into, right, it's not systematic, it's one individual. But this individual thereby is operating like a media magnet, right? It's like drawing all the attention. So it draws all the attention. So I think the interesting thing in Boltanski and Schiapello is, And Frederick Jameson, the cultural critic, Frederick Jameson also remarked that from a certain moment onwards, people stopped using the term capitalism. One can say capitalist economy, or one then says liberal economy, but there's no capitalism anymore, right? I mean, it just disappears somewhere in the 90s or late 80s. And the reason for that is because, I mean, ideological, there are many, I think, theoretical and ideological reasons to critique of the systems, right? I mean, one believes that system is a wrong philosophical category and so forth. But with that, one also throws out of the window or of the bathtub the good baby of systematic insight, right? I mean, one thinks there is no system. And that means, I think, and this has been, I think, this has been reinforced and reproduced through certain media coverage which was drawn to the individuals who are the symptoms of a crisis, but at the same time with very little media coverage that raises systematic questions, right? I mean, even today with, I mean, questions of green capitalism, the question is if capitalism is perceived as a system at all, right? I mean, the emphasis is always on green, and the ism is ignored in capitalism often, right? So in some sense, what I'm trying to say is these individuals are figures of disorientation fundamentally, and the media plays a role, a crucial role, in exactly presenting them as the origin of a problem, which they de facto aren't. So media's become reproductive institutions that lead I think the questions and the insights and the theoretical perspective away from questioning why these people exist in the first place in these positions of power.
Thank you so much, Professor Ruda, for being so patient and kind with us. For the official vote of thanks, I invite Aparna. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. It has been an intellectual treat to listen to Professor Frank Ruda speak. And on behalf of the Department of English and the organizing team, I would like to thank everyone who made today's event successful. First and foremost, a huge thank you to our speaker, Professor Frank Ruda, who has given us so much to reflect on. His talk was truly enriching, and as a think piece will be discussed beyond this evening and will certainly help us think through these issues. Thank you, Professor Frank Ruda, for lending us so much of your time and for sharing your insights with us. We are indeed grateful to you. As always, I would also like to thank our HOD, Professor Simi Malhotra. Thank you to Suman, Susan, Zara, and everyone on the organizing team who are responsible for running our event so smoothly.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for organizing this event. This was truly wonderful.
Thanks so much, Professor Ruda. We're so fortunate to have had you with us, and we're really, really grateful to you. Incidentally, next Friday, we have Alenka Zupanchit speaking to us. So it's going to be fantastic actually to club these two together. So thank you so much, Professor Ruda. We're so grateful to you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Have a nice day. Bye-bye.